Alrighty, and we are live. Take it away, Ross.
All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and all others joining us from. My name is Ross McIntire. I'm the technical director here at the Orpheum Theatre. I'm joined with Mr. Joey Lucero and our executive director, Aaron Glasnovich, here with us in the booth, as it were. It's kind of fun to be on the other side while they step around where I usually am, but we have a lot of exciting things and interesting little tidbits to share with you tonight. While we're waiting for people to sign on, I think we'll just kind of take our time getting into it. Joey, do you have a few things you want to throw out as part of the moderation part? You know, some questions and answering later, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so totally. What we're gonna do here. So as a part of the show, we're gonna do a little demonstration with the piano that Ross is gonna do here. We'll have a little Q&A coming later. So if you want to go ahead and dump your questions into the chat, you know, if we have time, we'll try and get to as many as we possibly can. I think that's about.
Oh, yeah.
That's about it. So why don't we get into it? Yeah, go ahead, Ross.
Yeah. Well, the whole point about the piano is a little interesting. Some people, a lot of people, probably don't know that. We have to, because of the spatial constraints in this building, we often find ourselves needing as much space on stage as possible. And one of the things on this stage that does take up a lot of room is our lovely Kawai grand piano. While we always, have found it very useful to have a grand piano already living in the theater, it's always a matter of where it lives to make the best use of our space. One of the things that we used to have to do is turn it on its side when very large shows came in, and we'd have to hire piano movers to come in, and three or four people usually would have to all work together very slowly and carefully, of course, to lower the piano onto its side, take its legs off, strap it to a board, and then slide it against the wall. And that whole operation used to take as long as 30 minutes, maybe longer, for them to be able to safely stow that off stage. And so back in the renovation period after our 100th birthday, one of the things that we had been looking to do is to kind of improve the state of not only the piano itself, as being moved manually by several people can be a little rough on it as it's set down, but it also was going to save everyone's backs, because that is very challenging work, as you can imagine. And there's a little company that we learned about called KTT LLC. It's kind of fun, but it's Keyboard Transportation Technologies, and it's out of it's based in Pennsylvania. And this device you see behind me, this red frame that is kind of strapped to the piano, is KTT's SmartMover, and it is designed to be able to move grand pianos either around within a space, within any kind of facility that one might live in. And there's different fixtures you can have on the base mover to then move them outside of a building, maybe load them onto a truck and then move them as far as you might want to move them. All things you can do without a device like this, but a device like this is very handy when you, like we do, have a small staff, and wanting to be able to move a piano with one person was kind of a little pipe dream. It used to be, but then with the discovery of this device, it ended up becoming a reality. So I'll kind of show you some of the, move that off, show you some of the features that you can see from here. I mean, we'll see it in action and all that in a second, but so basically this is the frame it sits on. It's got four wheels, and then there's an outrigger arm that kind of keeps its balance when it's doing this action. It stretches off over towards the treble end of the piano, the high strings are. And there's all manner of straps that keep it on the mechanism while it's picking it up. And what it does is it picks it up and then starts to tilt it on its side, and it ends up resting on this little loading plate here. I call it the couch since it's got cushions on it. So in a moment, we'll just go ahead and take that up. It takes a remarkably small amount of time for something so big. And really the only thing you have to make sure you watch out for is to get the casters out from under the wheels before you forget they're there and maybe step on them. So let me just give it one more little check. I like to call them the paranoia checks, just to make sure you did everything you're supposed to do. Make sure that everything's good. I like to give things little wiggles. As I've found with machines like this, if they can wiggle, it's not ready. And so it's nice and sturdy. Make sure the wheel locks are on. That's good. Everything's good. You can make that straps out of the way. That'll become important later. We look at this arm one more time, and we're ready to go. Now, it's got this telescoping little telephone cord control box here. It's really nice. It's remarkably simple, too. You have up and down. So for this demonstration, of course, we are going to be going up, and I believe we are ready to go. Okay. If somebody could sing me off with Magical Mr. Mistopheles from Cats, that's okay. I'll do it in my head. All right. And so it starts to lift the bass end first, then the treble end, and then the back as well. And I pause this frequently to keep the action moving. Making sure the casters don't get in the way of anything else. There we go. Okay, so once the casters are free, just set that one on my chair there. Once the casters are free, it's pretty much just taking it all the way up. The nice thing about this cord is you can also stay well out of the way, because even though these sorts of machines are very well designed, expressly not to drop it on you, it's always good to stay out of the way, just in case the machine feels differently today. So it's kind of fun to pause it here because it looks like a surrealist painting. We can continue up, 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 just like Magical Mr. Mistopheles, to the heaven side layer, heavy side layer, that's what it's called. And then it just kind of settles into place. And there you have it. Now, the first thing to do once you get it up like this is to put on the safety strap. Now, the strap is mostly needed for when you're moving it via truck, just so you have a heavier, all-encompassing strap that just holds it in place firmly to the mover. Make sure that's twisted. Very good. It's always kind of fun. This isn't really any different than the way I usually do it. I'm just usually not talking to somebody else. And you get that strap secured. Give it a quick little crank just to get some tension on there. There we go. Okay. Now, at this point, we can remove the outrigger arm because we're no longer needing it to counterbalance the action of raising this piano. Sorry, I was talking right into the mic. So this is that arm that balances the piano. One of the best features is this little fail-safe device here. This little tab welded onto the top that touches a little switch inside the machine, and unless that switch has been pushed, it won't turn on or do anything. And that was one of the things that the designer said became a necessity when he forgot to put it in for one of the test runs he was doing at his shop in his early days of building this machine, and it tipped over sideways. Luckily, it didn't have a piano on it. But the arm even has a little hole machined into it so you can hang it off the back of the piano. And I'll show you here in a moment when I turn that around where it mounts. So you got to undo your wheel locks naturally if you want it to move. You'd be surprised how often one can forget that. And then takes a bit of pushing to get it going, but once you get momentum, it's remarkably easy to move. So you can take your arm here, and in that little key slot, it's got a little screw here that fits right onto a little shoe down there to fit into. That way you don't wonder where you put it next time you're trying to get it out. Now, its ease of movement is deceptive because a lot of people say that these sorts of machines aren't meant for students at a college, for example, because they might think, oh, this rolls really fast. How fast can we get it going? It's always best to take it as slowly as possible. I like to kind of push it from the bottom with my shoe to prevent from pushing, as you might imagine, pushing too much on the top isn't going to take it anywhere but down. and it's going to take it down a lot more roughly than if you use the machine. Okay, so we'll kind of get that situated there. Real nice. And from here, you can take it any number of places. We've never left the building with it, but it's fun to know that if we ever had to, we could. At this point, we'd remove the legs. Here, you may notice I've already removed the pedal board. That's mostly just for ease of use. I like having this space open and be able to use the strap without worrying about it hitting the supports, and that leg too, of course. Usually we push this just against the wall over in the corner. We throw blankets over it to protect it on all sides, and then we store the legs all wrapped up in blankets underneath the stage. And move this caster with its friends. Don't want them to get lonely. Stick these over here. So there in a nutshell is how we move our piano around. I'm gonna take a little break from the piano.
I know we haven't gotten to the Q&A yet, but just a quick question because it has been asked regarding the piano mover. How much does one of those go for?
Well, I don't remember exactly what the number was, having not been involved in its purchasing. I do remember it being pretty close to $10,000. It was a purchase we couldn't make without the full force of the capital campaign behind us, providing that ample funding that would then allow us to say, oh, well, one of those things we've always needed, a piano mover. But I remember it being, it's actually very heavy on its own. It was the person who builds them was kind enough to drive it out here from Pennsylvania in just a pickup truck with a topper on it, and then we unloaded. It took 2 people to unload each piece, so it was pretty substantial in that sense. But then he stayed and set it up for us and showed us how to work it, and we ran through it about 3 or 4 times before he finally left. So it was well worth the cost associated with it. It's a extremely valuable machine to us at this point. In fact, fun fact is it's the 27th one the guy ever built. So I like to call it number 27. I'm very creative that way. So yeah, I hope that I know it's not a direct answer to that question, but it's probably a pretty good ballpark. I mean, it's a relatively simple machine in what it's built out of, but the design is extremely complex, and the hydraulic mechanism, especially, that lifts the piano like that. It was worth every penny that it costs, I think. Need a little drink there. So at this point, we want to take a little break from me standing up and moving things around. And one of the things we always like to do when people come in for tours of the theater, which sadly we can't do now, but we used to do with relative frequency, at least once a week. It feels like people would come in for one reason or another. Maybe they'd be on a trip on the train and they have a bit of a layover or something it may be. But they'll come in, people will, and they'll ask to look around, and they're always really delighted when we say, oh, well, you're in luck, we do that. And we usually sit people down and give them the whole history of the place just to make sure they're committed before then we walk them around. But it's usually one of my favorite parts to tell, because a lot of people remember the Orpheum as a fixture of their childhood, whether those people be from the movie theater era or from the modern era today, where people have seen it throughout their childhoods, whether it be the movies of the old days, the musicals and the symphony performances and the movies that we show now, that were not a movie theater. But the Orpheum's history begins in 1916, when it was built. It was opened on August 21st, which was a Monday in 1916. It had taken about 9 months to build. They had started in 1915. William J. Olson was a local businessman who ran the Gaiety Theater on Cherry Street. It's right there at the intersection of Cherry and Simmons. It's right where the Palo Salon is now. There's an old building. Wasn't a very impressive looking one. The one photograph I've ever seen of it, it looks like just a cinder block, 1-story building, maybe sat 100 people tops, I'd think. But the point is that William J. Olson, who built the Orpheum, was running that theater, and he saw that Galesburg had a need for a high-class vaudeville theater. And for those of you who don't know, vaudeville was an art form of live performance that mostly existed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It stretches in either direction, depending on what you think of as vaudeville. Some people would say that, minstrelsy was a predecessor to vaudeville, and that the sitcom might be, a successor to vaudeville. Who's to say? It's personal opinion, probably. But vaudeville was a very popular art form preceding television. And so it's amazing to think that places like this were built when people for entertainment couldn't just sit in their homes and stare at the corner. They came down to a lovely, enormous, beautifully built room to see people from the town they knew, they didn't know, sit with people and all watch something together. And that was the value of live theater back then. And so at that time, there were probably between, depending on which ones are still standing, maybe 6 or 7 theaters in the downtown area alone. Some of them being the West Theater, the Colonial Theater, the Gaiety Theater I just mentioned, the Auditorium Theater on Broad Street that stood just across from the old Broadview Hotel, and numerous others that I can't think of right at the moment. But the Orpheum was built kind of to be the king of theaters in Galesburg, perhaps the queen, it doesn't really matter. Galesburg is uniquely situated on the railroad in the touring show, let's say, that was leaving Chicago would come down on either the Burlington or the Santa Fe Railroad, didn't matter. They would have to come through Galesburg, and then before then taking your pick, where you go, in San Francisco or Los Angeles, or all points in between. And so Galesburg was a nice jumping off point for a lot of those tours right before they had to, pick a direction they were going west. And so like many things, the railroad uniquely positioned Galesburg to have, quite the assortment of theaters. And like I said, the Orpheum was meant to be the real good one. William J. Olson wanted there to be a theater that was befitting of all the finest acts in vaudeville, which at the time would have included George Burns, Fanny Brice, the Marx Brothers, Harry Houdini, Blackstone the Magician, Al Jolson. A lot of those different performers that were really, really big back then played on this stage. In fact, legend has it that Harry Houdini cut a hole in the floor right over there under the back leg of the table Joey and Aaron are sitting at, but that's for another video. We have a rug over it right now. The vaudeville era, though, was very, very exciting for the theater world. There was a rather distinct style that theaters like this were built in, and the stage did not have to be very big. And so a lot of times people will ask us why our stage is so small, especially visiting shows. And that's often what we have to explain is that, well, when it was built, vaudeville, didn't require a lot of set pieces. It was very just kind of fly by the seat of your pants little shows sometimes, where people trying to get noticed. And so we have behind us, for example, this beautiful painted flat. Let me just push the piano out of the way just a little bit for this part. And flats like these, and we call them flats because they are pine frames, with muslin stretched across them, stapled in place and painted. And this is one of our forest sets. We have, I think, 3 more of these to make a set of 4. And they are kind of book flats, what they called. They fold like that. And there would have been either stretched all the way across the back of the stage, or maybe they'd be used as, the side pieces to kind of imply one was in a forest. But it's a unique scenic element we don't really use too often anymore, because nowadays when we have those sorts of shows, we use just, drops, we call them, which is just a painted sheet that hangs down. And so we were actually fortunate to have held on to these for so long. They were forgotten and neglected for almost all of their existence. They are over 100 years old. These came with the building when William J. Olson had it built. One of the things you needed was scenery for a show. So there's a set with a forest, there's a set with the old Custer Ballroom, and there's a set with the Orpheum lobby. And actually, one of the pieces, which includes the Orpheum lobby, you can find at the Antique Mall. Up in the top floor. The Galesburg Historical Society was very kind as to accept our donation. It's extremely small, so it was a little bit of work, extremely thin, but it was very tall, excuse me. It's a little difficult getting it up there, but we got it. But this is an example of the kind of scenery they would have been working with back then. However, our small stage didn't really matter for much longer, because as of the 1930s, the Orpheum was closed and renovated to become solely a movie theater. At that point, air conditioning equipment was added. There was a pipe organ installed right down at the front of the stage, in front of where the orchestra pit was, which was then expanded to incorporate that pipe organ. And the mezzanine, which is our second level where all the boxes are, was reduced from the original set of, let's see, what would that be, 13 boxes, down to now we only have 6. And all these renovations were furthering the goal of making the Orpheum a more modern movie palace, as opposed to an old opera house that was retrofitted. And so as time went by, those same kind of changes kept happening to the theater. when it became the kind of second fiddle theater downtown in the 1970s, that's the period I refer to it as, was when the Twin West Cinemas, which was Galesburg's other beloved downtown movie theater, kind of pushed out the Orpheum in terms of its ability to thrive as a movie theater, because the Orpheum, as you may know, has only one screen, one auditorium. The Twin West was unique in that it was two theaters that happened to be next door to each other. The West, which was the big white one with the glazed bricks, and the Colonial with all the decorative, elements there. And they found it convenient when the same company bought both of those buildings and decided to make it a two-screen movie theater. That ended up spelling the demise of the Orpheum, as being only able to show one movie at a time. It was not near as profitable. It continued throughout the 70s and into the very early 80s to be used as a movie theater for either big premieres or maybe just to fill time, fill space, and try and sell a few extra tickets to some reruns or B movies, whatever it may be. In any case, the Orpheum was not as prestigious to the town as it was when it was first built by the 1980s. In 1982, it suffered perhaps the most humiliating thing that can happen to a theater. It was closed. The newspaper advertised that the last movie shown would be The Sender. That was a 1982 psychological thriller that no one I've ever spoken to has heard of. So if you've heard of it, please drop that in the comments. Let us know what you thought of The Sender. And if you were one of the people who showed up that night to watch the movie, please tell us. We'd love to get in touch and ask you how that felt. But it was kind of a sad night because the staff anticipated an enormous turnout for what was plainly advertised in the paper as the last movie the Orpheum was going to show before it permanently closed. It was all spelled out there. And the staff was ready for a rush. They popped all the popcorn they had in stock. They filled up enormous garbage bags of it. They were popping it all day. I spoke to somebody who worked there at the time. He told me. And 2 people bought tickets that night to see the show. And there were more people on staff, therefore, than were actually holding tickets. So they, the person I spoke to said that they handed out the entire garbage bags of popcorn to each person. Everybody from the staff took one, and they all sat down and watched The Sender. The other sad bit was the theater's management had already sent away all the marquee letters, or at least all the ones they could manage to send away to other theaters in anticipation of closing. But they had forgotten to leave an S so they could spell sender. So they spelled it with a Z. So the Orpheum's final marquee was the Zender. And at the end of the night, when the movie was over and the 2 patrons had left, one of the staff went out on the ladder, got up on the marquee, and took out the Z on the front of Zender and the E and the R at the end of Zender and left it reading the end. And they turned the lights off and went home. And it was slated to be demolished a short time thereafter until the timely intervention by Prairie Players Civic Theater and the Knox County Civic Center Authority Board, which eventually ended up being our current administrative body called the Knox County Metropolitan Exposition Auditorium and Office Building Authority. But we just call it the Orpheum Theater for short. Those 2 entities between the county board and Prairie Players Civic Theater really led the charge for renovating the Orpheum. Prairie Players really kind of led the fundraising drive, and they were able to, through that county affiliation then, raise almost $3 million to complete the renovation on the theater, and that's not to forget all the small donations that poured in during that time from community members to save the place. In fact, some people who I've known from years gone by told me about what they termed the dirt parties, where they would put out temporary, work lighting with generators and invite people in off the streets and to look at the old, derelict Orpheum Theater to see what interest there was in renovation. And apparently, all the people who didn't come to the Sender came to the dirt parties and were really excited for the Orpheum to be revived. And we're glad they did. Because then at the end of that renovation, the theater was able to reopen in 1988 with a performance of Henry Mancini's orchestra, or at least Henry Mancini and an orchestra. I'm not exactly sure if they travel with him or not, but it was a grand reopening befitting of such a beautiful place, rescued from the ravages of demolition by a community that was dedicated to doing so. And so I'd like to take this brief moment to thank everyone involved in the renovation for allowing us to continue to preserve this beautiful theater on Kellogg Street. And that's something that we should all feel very lucky that we have. And then not too long afterwards, Prairie Players put on their first musical in the space, which is South Pacific, which I'm told was an excellent production. And then as the 90s progressed, Prairie Players then ended its involvement with the theater, and the theater then kind of incorporated as its own 501c3 nonprofit organization in 2006. And from that point until now, that is kind of the way we've been functioning since 2006, is as our own nonprofit organization. We have a variety of series we present, like the Orpheum Theatre Presents, formerly known as the Red Carpet series. We have Yes, our youth entertainment series. We have Throwback Thursdays, which shows free movies in the summer. Shucks, we won't get to it this year, but next year, just you wait, it's going to be great. And a variety of tenants that from our community that present really great content in the theater: Choral Dynamics, Prairie Players, Dancers Studio, Performing Arts Academy, all kinds of people call this place home. We even have the Fair Queen pageant, which is pretty fun. Apparently, it's the only one that's both indoors and air conditioned in the entire state. We're pretty proud of that here. But that's usually the spiel I give for the history. So at this point, Jerry,
all right,
what am I doing next?
Why don't we head into the Q&A here?
Oh yeah, let's do.
We had a couple questions in the comment section we'll get to.
Good.
So guys, if you have any more questions for Ross, go ahead and leave those in there, and we'll try and get to them. First, let's start with Hollis posed a question regarding an instance where there was a flood at the theater. Can you talk a little bit more about the ongoing plight dealing with the elements, specifically flooding at the Orpheum? That
is a neat one. As we all know, living in Galesburg, we may not have tornadoes, but boy, do we have floods. Thank you, St. Crescent, for that. We, like anyone downtown, have had our issues with drainage. In fact, there have been several renovation projects that either the city or the Orpheum has done on our back alley to improve rainwater drainage, but we're always seem to be just only a half step ahead of the rain. Hollis is referring specifically, I can actually remember that time, he's referring specifically to a particularly rainy season where the volume of water crashing down on our back parking lot, and therefore washing up on our back wall. I remember it was actually standing water out in our parking lot. The pressure of that water hitting the seam between our brick wall and the vault that carries our electricity in from the underground wiring system, that the water was actually seeping into the building around where those conduits come in. It wasn't in the conduits, because we would have noticed a little faster, but it was coming in around the conduits into is actually the one of the bathrooms in the basement. And it was Dancer Studio was in residence, and they suddenly came to me asking about why there was suddenly all this water. And so that was another one of those issues where we do our best to catch them when they come, and perform all the good preventative maintenance, like caulking the seams and trying to fill in cracks when they develop on the back wall. But it's one of those things where you have to kind of accept that you're going to deal with it once in a while, and just have all the safeguards in place to do so. One of my mentors early on in the years, Roger Schoonover, a lovely man, he had told me when I first started that if I was going to do this job, I had to wake up at the first clap of thunder and be at the theater by the second one, because of the risks associated with sudden cloud bursts and our drainage being overwhelmed from that. But in the last couple of years, we have done a lot of different projects. Namely, one of them was having our downspouts and gutters replaced. That definitely improved the drainage off of the top of the theater. But when it comes to the drains that go under the streets next to the theater, we're still kind of fighting that as we go. But we do keep up with it a lot better than we used to. That's for sure. So thank you, Hollis, for that question.
All righty. Next question comes from Cece. She asks, she wishes to know, what is under the stage?
What is under the stage? Below me right now is a wall, actually. If I were over here, it would be the hallway that runs under the stage. In fact, because under the stage is where the dressing rooms are, for those of you who do not know. And that has actually remained constant throughout the theater's history. When the theater was first built, that's the way it was. All the dressing rooms were under the stage. It's a little differently shaped now. In the renovation they did in 1988, they completely changed the layout of the basement to make it more friendly to modern companies. It used to be that there were several small dressing rooms, as you might expect for vaudeville, when you have one person. If George Burns himself is coming, then darn it, George Burns doesn't need an enormous company dressing room. And so they altered that to have a couple of small dressing rooms and a couple of large ones, and then restroom facilities with showers and everything. Our boiler room is also down there. And so there's also in the front there, some of you may have noticed when you're here that the stage is at different lengths at different times. And we actually have a cover we put over our orchestra pit to bring it to the level of the stage so that we can, kind of have that space that is otherwise lost by having an orchestra pit. Of course, it's removable if we ever need it, but in the 8 years I've worked here, we've removed it maybe 5 times. And so that's pretty good. It's really difficult to do, so that's nice. And then there's an extension, we call it, that goes on the front of that adds 5 more feet, stretching almost to the front row of the audience. And so under all of that is generally just some negative space. But under the stage, dressing rooms, electrical closet, boiler room, all those sorts of equipments that would otherwise need to be hidden in the walls, maybe we can put down in the basement. So it's a good question. Thank you very much. Not a whole lot of people ask about the dressing rooms.
All righty. Next question comes from a man named Orly.
Orly.
I actually know a guy named Orly. I wonder if it's the same guy.
Might be.
But he asks, what is the most dangerous mechanism in the theater?
Most dangerous mechanism in the theater. Yeah, everything above my head comes to mind. But you see, I guess it's a matter of what's dangerous. Nothing is dangerous if you use it right. Is always the way I think of it. The mechanism most likely to cause grievous bodily harm, gee whiz. Well, I guess the easy one is the fly system because of the nature of what it does. It lifts things that are hundreds, so in one case, thousands of pounds above our heads. And that's no small feat, in fact, very large feat, several feet, in fact, all the way up. And so one of the things that we're always watching out for when we have community shows is that oftentimes people who are designing for community shows are working with very small budgets. And so what they'll try and do is save money on what is considered small things like hanging things above people's heads. And so we've had certain circumstances where I've had to either tell people not to hang something with fishing line or baling wire or duct taping some baling wire to a batten. And I've either had to tell them not to do that or come back secretly once rehearsal's over, which is actually one thing I did during a show one summer, and redo something someone did wrong because I didn't want to embarrass them. And so I think that's probably the biggest margin of error is when you're working with the fly system. There are stories I've heard of shows gone by where there are far more extensive crews full of people that might not have been as experienced with the fly system helping with it, and the stories of overloaded battens and somebody walks up and unlocks it to bring it down, but oh, that's the one they just unloaded, and so the pipe flies away and the weight carriage slams down. And that hasn't happened in the time I've been here exactly. We have had a few things start to be a little scary, but there's a small comfort we can take in our fly systems certification, because back in 2013, it was 2013, wasn't it? When I was first, it was about a year after I was first hired, and I had come from a college in Chicagoland where they observed very strict rigging standards. And so coming to the Orpheum and seeing how people rigged things for shows, I about died. And so I was able to convince the board of directors to fund an inspection and a kind of a renovation and then a certification of our fly system by a company out of Chicago called Chicago Fly House. It's a great company who deals with a lot of really heavy rigging projects around Chicago and around the state and the wider area. And so we knew that if we had them come in and look at our fly system and give us the things to change or change things themselves, that would be a much safer system. And so we actually were able to obtain Chicago Fly House's safer venue certification back then. So and as that, as we haven't made any changes to it since then that weren't positive changes, I can safely say that our fly system is still in the best shape it can be. It's very well built, very well designed. It's picked up a lot of really heavy things. In fact, the last bit on that, and then we'll move on. Back in 2013, that same year, we actually had a show come in. It was Cirque Mechanics. It was a real fun show. You might have been there if you were one of the people who was lucky enough to. They had to lift an enormous truss in the air that both lights and people would be hanging and swinging from. And that truss alone, I think, weighed about 2,000 pounds. And so they had 4 chain hoists that they used to pick it up by the beams in our ceiling themselves. It wasn't even technically part of the fly system, it's part of the structure. So after that show, I was pretty confident in this stage house's ability to bear weight. So yeah, the fly system is pretty spooky, but it's safe if you know what you're doing, and that's why only people that know what they're doing handle it.
All right, thank you. So our next question, Naomi wonders, technically speaking, see what you did there. What was the most challenging show / performance since you have been at the Orpheum?
Most challenging. Thinking about it, I remember when we would have actually been that same show, Cirque Mechanics, actually, and there's a different reason than what I just said. That was a show that was it's one of those shows that when it arrived, it ended up being quite a bit bigger than we'd anticipated. The lighting for it was extensive. I mean, I had 4 booms on each side of the stage filled with lights, shins, mids, mid-highs, heads, all manner of things. There were little lights on floor stands all around. And then all of that in addition to the set pieces they were bringing in and the enormous truss they lifted in the air. One of the scariest things about that was their trampoline. Because in addition to everything else they brought with that big, 1-ton truss and everything else, they told us in the rider to be prepared because the total show weight of everything they were bringing was 10,000 pounds. So between the ceiling, the walls, and the floor, it was a lot of weight being put on the structure. And that was a testament to its strength. However, oh boy, was that scary to watch because they had this trampoline that they would roll out and they would be bouncing from the trampoline up to, well, a little bit shorter than that drop, actually, was the platform they were jumping onto. And when they left, we realized that the two, where the feet of the trampoline were, had kind of pressed little grooves into the tongue and groove floor that we have. After a while, they did settle back out, but it was a little funny looking at those spots afterwards. Very heavy show, very extensive, very involved. One of the most impressive shows I've ever seen. I'll finish it with that. It was a delightful show. The acrobats swinging out on ropes over the audience. The man who was inside a giant metal wheel and he was running in it, like a hamster would, but it wasn't in a frame. He would just run it out to the very tip of the edge of the stage and then he'd stop and roll it back. Ooh, it was a great show. Honestly, the juggler was my favorite part, and that was the least impressive. He was just good. But yeah, we've had a lot of great shows, but that'd probably be the most challenging. Truly, it was a very long 20-hour day, in fact. So great, thank you. Good question. Trip down memory lane.
All righty. Excuse me. Next question is from CC and Charlotte.
Oh, both of them, nice.
Yeah, and they wish to know how the spotlight works. I know you do have a technically speaking episode about that particular subject. Perhaps this would be a good time to let everyone know to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you haven't already, go back and catch up on some of the other technically speaking episodes.
I can give you a short version. The light bulb sits, we call them lamps. The lamp sits inside a large reflective housing, and the tube, as one might say, of the spotlight is kind of to focus all that light, as is the reflector. It focuses it in this very neat beam. Never look at it; it'll burn the eyes clean out of your head. And then after that is a succession of both lenses to help focus that light into a more cohesive spot. And then there are various fixtures like irises or little barn doors and different ways to focus that and even drop color in front of it. They work very well. I can say that for certain. And the ones we've had have had a lot of mileage on them, and they're still running great after it's almost 10 years now we've had them. And that means they're almost obsolete. So it'll only be a matter of time before I'll be explaining new ones. But anyway, yeah, they're pretty great. If anybody ever wants to get in the ground floor volunteering for crew here at the Orpheum Theater, Spotlight is always where I start people because it's one of the easiest things to do. You would not believe how easy it is. It's easier than riding a bike even, so you don't have to do anything with your feet. So, that's a good question, though. Thank you.
Our next question comes from our friend Aaron Whitehurst.
Aaron Whitehurst, how you doing?
And he asks, or he says, Yeah, he asks, sorry. If there was a Gobo to define you, what would it look like? Would it come with a certain light filter? I'm thinking something like when they see it on stage, people say, yep, that's Ross.
Oh, there's a really good leaf breakup that Roscoe Lux makes. That's a pretty good one. It's been my go-to for almost the entire time I've worked here. So that'd be one I'd throw out to be a good possibility. There's also just the Gobo of the Istanbul skyline that we inexplicably have. Maybe it's not one to define me, but it's certainly one I like looking at.
Real quickly here too.
Yes.
For the people that don't know, what is a Gobo?
A Gobo, yes. My phone constantly corrects it to hobo, so even Apple doesn't know what it is. Gobos are a slang term for, the easiest thing to say is it's a cutout. It's a pattern. It's usually etched or cut out of a very thin piece of heat-resistant steel, because you're putting it inside of a light, this pattern. So you can project an image onto a wall, a curtain, the floor, wherever it is you want to put it. They're sometimes used in architectural lighting to project things on the sides of buildings. My old college actually had a bunch of Gobos made just for their 150th anniversary, had them in buildings all over the campus, so you can get them in almost any format. You also get them made out of glass. We have a Gobo that you may have seen in shows where you came in, that we were either doing a Yes show or an Orpheum Theatre Presents show, where we actually have Yes and Orpheum Theatre Gobos that are glass, so they're a lot more durable and they last longer. And those can be used to project those images onto the walls. You can actually make your own Gobos, fun fact, at home with a pie tin and courage, really, because if you're going to cut anything, if you're going to cut a pie tin into shapes, you're going to have to, have a very steady hand. It's not as easy as it looks. But it's a fun way to add kind of a personalization to either an event or any old show. There are very specific Gobos. Like I said, there's the Istanbul skyline that the Orpheum Theatre came by at some point. I'd really like to know when and why. But then there are the ones that I use all the time. We call those the leaf breakups. They look like sunlight coming through the branches of a tree. Nice little dappling of light on the ground. It's very popular for like rock shows and things like that, especially when you have excuse me, especially when you have a fog or a hazer element, having Gobos shooting shafts of light through that, it looks really cool. And so it's a pretty common element, but we don't use it in every show. So it's actually a good question. I'm glad you brought it up.
So in conclusion, what Gobo are you? What Gobo defines you?
Oh, still think it's that good leaf breakup.
The leaf breakup?
Yeah, no, I'll have to throw that on the next Tech Speaks when we talk about we'll actually let's just do one on Gobos. Why not? That'll be fun.
Totally. So it's a light stencil then.
Yeah, that's a perfect, Joey. I'm so glad I have Joey here. I've never actually thought of that either. That's a really good name for it. Light stencil. There you go.
Aaron just whispered that one to me.
Nice. That's a good one.
All right. So our next question here comes from a man named Tim Holmes.
Tim Holmes.
Yeah, I wonder who that guy is. Anyway, he wants to know if there are any ghosts in the Orpheum Theatre.
Other than me, no. Yeah, well, that's the fun fact about the history of people who have done my job specifically. Not to say that other people who have worked at the Orpheum in the past haven't also been Orpheum ghosts of their own. Colloquially, to me, an Orpheum ghost is anybody who is at the theater when it's closed, turning lights on and off, and then when people see that, they think there's a ghost. That's how the oldest Orpheum ghost developed, is people driving by, walking by, and suddenly seeing a fully lit up stage with nobody on it extinguish. Well, obviously the person who was just on the stage has walked out of view and turned the lights off, but it does look rather spooky. We do have a lot of ghosts that, in the more literal sense, none that we've all seen at the same time, but everyone has their own little experiences. For me, it's Sarah is the ghost I'm most familiar with. She's a little girl who lives in the projector booth, and she does not come out very often. In fact, after 2013, I only saw her once, but that first time, that was the most vivid. We all have our own experiences about that. There's a ghost I like to call the dweller on the threshold. That's basically any dark doorway. The dweller on the threshold's in there. I don't think I've ever walked by a dark doorway in this building and not sensed the dweller on the threshold. He's always there. She's always there. They're always there. It's always a different ghost. Another popular ghost is the man in seat G2. Now, down here, you have on the right-hand section of the theater when you're looking at the stage. That's how we gauge that, by the way. So if you're ever in here and you're saying right, left, center, where is it? Well, you should know where center is. The left and right is when you're facing the stage. And so looking out on the right-hand side, what is that? D, E, F, G, fourth row back, to count. The first chair off the aisle, that's seat G2. And over the years, numerous people, enough for me to think to know it's not just some isolated phenomenon, numerous people complain of feeling a certain presence in that seat. And I say complain because it's mostly just a cold, kind of chilling feeling. And oftentimes that's accompanied with the feeling that maybe, you know, you're in somebody else's chair. I've heard a lot of stories about different ghosts that occupy seat G2. Usually they're stories that I've heard at almost every other theater I've ever worked or been to, about people who died in their seat during a show or some such thing and had to be snuck out by the ushers. That's actually from my old college. But regardless of what you think that ghost is or represents, no one can deny that seat G2 is something of a foreboding place to sit. That'd probably be the other most popular ghost. Usually when I give tours, I'll invite people to sit in seat G2, and they, especially when I give the tours to the Steel fifth graders every year, that's usually a pretty fun one. They are always very excited to go sit in seat G2. In fact, I think they talk to each other about it. But in any case, ghosts or no ghosts, there's certainly a building for it, because if I may digress very briefly, there's a certain energy that in places that have existed for this long and had this many people in it, there's a certain feeling to them. And it's the same feeling that you'd have, the same feeling you have in an old theater is feelings you might have in an old church, an old office building, any old cavernous place that, and because a lot of old places used to be a lot more cavernous than they are now, any old place that's been around for a long time, I think elicits a certain response in people when they walk into it, especially a place that has contained so much music and so much laughter and so much anger, I'm sure, so much human experience, that I think when you walk into a place like this, you can't help but feel something, someone. And that's kind of how I feel about seat G2. That's why that's one of the more reliable ghost stories, is because it's a pretty universal experience. No one else has ever seen Sarah, so I can't prove her, but the seat G2, that's something. That's something interesting. So, good question.
So our next question, it was from the stream we had at noon this morning, but I think it'd be a good time to mention this question. Okay. It was Zoe's, and it pertained to the current closure. Her ballet at Dancer Studio was postponed due to the pandemic. She wonders when the theater will reopen again.
Well, we don't have a good answer for that right now. We're kind of waiting to see how things shake out over the summer. It's certainly not safe for us to have full-scale events yet, and that was what drove the decision, not only our decision, but chiefly the decisions of the various people who run different organizations that use the theater. Each one of them, one by one, had to make that very difficult decision not to have their show this summer. And while we do miss having people in here for those shows, as well as our own, Throwback Thursdays won't be happening this summer, obviously, we can assure you that when the time comes that it is safe to have everyone back in, we will be welcoming everyone back in as quickly as we can. We're in the midst of developing our reopening plan, using the best advice available to us. And when we know it's going to be safe to reopen, we will. That's about as good as it gets.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, there's some discrepancy about this next subject.
Dear, oh dear.
So based on your own research, where do you sit in regards to where in Galesburg the Marx Brothers got their names? And for those that don't know, can you tell that story of how they got their names and why?
It's a good story. It's got some good scholarship behind the disagreement. I can't say that I can prove anything. Everybody who has an opinion about it, I think it comes from as well informed a place as possible. When the Orpheum was being kind of conceived of is when it's been decided that the Marx Brothers got their nicknames. So one thing I can firmly put to rest is that the Marx Brothers did not get their nicknames in the Orpheum Theater. Did not happen. The Orpheum Theater had not been built yet when they received their nicknames. However, one thing that is very certain is that it happened in Galesburg. The story goes that they were sitting somewhere, whether it be, well, first I'll give you the rundown of the places it could have been. It could have been at the Auditorium Theatre on Broad Street, which was still a theater then, and it had been built well beforehand, so that's a certain possibility. There's also the Gaiety Theater, which is the one in question. The man who built this theater ran on Cherry Street, the Gaiety being the second one. And some people have even speculated that it could have just been at the Union Hotel, which is the predecessor to the Broadview Hotel, and being right across the street from the Auditorium Theater, it's very possible that may have been true as well. But the story goes, and the story came directly from Groucho Marx himself, or the story went that they were in Galesburg somewhere, and they had just finished a show, and a certain monologuist, which is, I think, well, I guess is what Jay Leno did. And a certain monologuist named Art Fisher was backstage. That implies, now you know how I feel. Art Fisher was playing cards with them somewhere. And he was a witty man, and these Marx brothers with no, individual funny names of their own, still using their birth names, they were all in a flick of a dealt card. They were bestowed these names by Art Fisher. The man who was very angry at, having lost several hands in a row was named Groucho. And that made him even angrier, and his brothers thought that was so funny, so they kept calling him Groucho. The womanizer in the bunch was named Chico, which then, after they took the K out, it read Chico, so people started calling him Chico. He got that name from Art Fisher. And then Harpo, that was easy. He played the harp, so the mouth harp, I think specifically in that show or in that instance, so he got the name Harpo. And then the fourth Marx brother at that time, Gummo, got his name because he wore rubber-soled gumshoes, as they called them back then. Also galoshes, because he was a sickly child. His mother made him wear galoshes when he left the house. But in any case, he had very soft shoes, and he would use them to sneak around backstage and come up behind the other brothers as they waited for their entrance and scare them in some manner. I don't know. He was a sneaky man. And so they were all given those nicknames with a deal of a card. And from then on, they used those nicknames professionally. Zeppo Marx was the younger of the Marx brothers. He came along later, and they named him just to match the other names. I think in that case, it was kind of a play off Zippo, because he was a little kid always running around. So they're like, oh, Zippo. Nicknames back then, it was very popular just to take something and throw an O on the end. It was very fun, I suppose. But yeah, so the Marx brothers did receive their names in Galesburg, and it was not here. I can safely say any of those things. If you disagree, let's talk. I don't know about what. But the contention then is between those three places, the Gaiety, the Auditorium, the Union Hotel. I may be missing one, but those are the three that I'm aware of. I think that any of those are certain possibilities, because who's to say? Groucho Marx himself will admit that he has a notoriously unreliable memory. But seeing as though they can actually all have a consensus, apparently the brothers did have a consensus that it was in Galesburg. And it was over a card game. It was with Art Fisher, and those were their names. It's a very interesting piece of scholarship, because it's almost impossible to prove, so what's juicier than that? But every theory has its merit, and I think that's the most important thing to remember when discussing something like this, because who's to say, really? If we could prove it, that'd be great. I'd be over the moon, because then I wouldn't have to tell people, I don't know. But it is nice to be able to know that it wasn't here, having happened before the theater existed. So very good question, always something to keep digging on. And the Marx brothers are pretty great. Check them out. They're funny.
Very quickly, who were the Marx brothers?
Oh, you mean like their names?
No, like
just what they did. Oh, shoot, didn't even say that. The Marx brothers were a comedic vaudeville troupe made up of, at any given point, four brothers. Gummo left after a while, and Zeppo took his place. I wish I knew all of their birth names, but it's far easier to remember Groucho, Chico, Harpo, Gummo, and Zeppo. But they were early pioneers of vaudeville. Before they had their fun nicknames, they were just schlepping around the U.S., going to little vaudeville houses here and there and back again. They landed at one point, whether or not they got their nicknames there, they had been at the Gaiety before. They did perform at the Orpheum, I think years after it opened, perhaps in 1918. We know they were here because there's a little notice about it, but it's not that we have photocopied, but it's not dated to my knowledge, so it'd be kind of hard to pinpoint exactly when. The theater, the theater over the years never really kept consistent records from the vaudeville era. I think once the movie era showed up, they probably just threw it all out. A few things we've been able to find, little artifacts, torn up notes in the attic of the theater are really interesting, but once we piece all those together, I can tell you what they say. But that's about as good as it gets for us when it comes to history, is either it was in the newspaper or we don't know about it.
Awesome.
Cool.
Speaking of names,
Oh.
Charlotte wants to know where the Orpheum got its name from.
It's a good question too. The Greek hero Orpheus is the root of that name. The story of Orpheus is that he was the short version, I promise, is the story of Orpheus being that he was an expert musician. He's most often associated with a lyre, and he played such lovely, beautiful music. And his the short story is his wife Eurydice was taken into the underworld, and he went to the gates after her, and the gates refused to open, and so he played music so beautiful that the very stones on the ground wept, and the gate was flung open to him, and Hades came out and said, "Great job, you've made it. Eurydice will follow you out now, but you have to turn around and walk out and trust that she's walking right behind you, and if you turn around, you'll both be condemned to stay in the underworld." And so Orpheus started walking out, and Eurydice did not know of the arrangement and how it was supposed to work, and so she was following him, and at one point she called out his name, Orpheus, and he turned around, and then he immediately forgot who he was and why he was there, and he sat down, and she sat down, and they stayed there in the underworld forever. But the whole idea of him being, sorry, that kind of dipped down a little bit in tone. The story, though, of Orpheus being he is, representative of great music. That was kind of his big selling point, was that he was, a fine musician. And so when they were naming all of these, when the trend of building, a series of theaters, a franchise, if you will, which is how the early Orpheum circuit, is what they called it, operated. One of the ideas was to have a fun, fancy name for it. There's a lot of them around. Like there's quite a few theaters. Like what are a few of those ones? Like the Paramount. There's quite a few Paramounts, across the country. Orpheums. There's the whole Nickelodeons. That's not really a fancy name, but the idea of all these theaters having one name and having there be some kind of connotation to that. So an Orpheum theater, it kind of does speak to our neoclassical architectural elements. I love how you can't see any of those right now, but I promise they're there. If you've ever been in here, we have these enormous neoclassical columns that adorn our boxes and our lobby. And there's a lot of those columnar elements on the front of the building, mixed in with a lot of those other architectural styles like Baroque and French Second Empire. But ultimately, yes, Orpheus and Orpheum being a reference to those kind of Greek idyllic kind of artistic themes. And I think that was kind of tied into the grandeur of the construction of this theater, was that it would have such a classical name like the Orpheum. So that's kind of the... It was supposed to be the short answer, sorry. So, a good question nonetheless, very good. Not a whole lot of people know that.
All righty. Matt wants to know, what is in the attic of the Orpheum?
Well, there's a lot of attics. The principal thing, which people can see from the street more often than not, is the projection booth. And the projection booth is behind those three circular windows. There's actually five, but in the center section, there's three spread across. They're the larger versions, spread across the frontmost part of our mansard roof, and that's what they call that. If you've ever seen our green glazed clay tile roof on the front of the theater, that's called a mansard. And the windows, porthole windows, are set into that. And it's kind of fun like that. So the three in the middle have the projection booth right behind it. Then the projection booth immediately, looks into the theater. So it's actually one of the only sources of sunlight in the theater is those three porthole windows into the projection booth. We still have a projector from the late 1970s, I think is when you can date it to, just looking at the fixtures. It's been up there, through the renovation. I think they spruced it up and added extra equipment. But that projector is one of the oldest fixtures in the building that's not original. Also up there is our hot water boiler it was part of our HVAC renovation we just did a few years ago to help better regulate the temperature inside the building. There's the old DC generator, the DC generator that used to regulate the electricity for the projector and so on. And then above the auditorium is mostly just empty crawl space. It's kind of a fun little land that, you never really know if it's night or day or up or down in there because there's no lights. And that's where all the duct work and all the electrical conduit and all the ceiling lights you see come down through there. And then all the way at the front, or I suppose the back, depending on where you're looking from, right above the front of the stage, up there in the attic is the fan room. And that's where our enormous fan works, night and day, all year round, moving the air and making sure the temperature is nicely regulated in here, as well as all the, different air ducts and things that collect the air. The attic of where we are right now, however, the stage house is what I call this part of the building. Fun fact, the building is technically separated into two somewhat separate structures. They're integrated, of course, but in order to better regulate the potential for a fire to break out on stage and spread to the rest of the building, the stage house is almost an entirely separate structure. Obviously, the biggest opening between the two being the stage opening, and then only one other opening being the stage door on the side, which leads backstage. Those being the only two openings kind of better regulates the chance that a fire might be able to spread. But right at the top above our heads is all the guts of the fly system, the I-beams that support, all of that equipment, as well as our acoustic shells. If you've ever been to a symphony concert, we hang the acoustic shells from the back wall on an enormous winch. That's all a good time up there. But honestly, the most common thing you'll find in any of our attics is dust. It's always fun coming out of there looking like a Welsh coal miner. At this point, I would be remiss if I forgot the other little prop in my background. Let me arrange some things real quick. I showed you this lovely scenic flat on this side, but you might have noticed at the beginning there was a little poster off to the side on an easel. Let me move this over here. Kind of give it a little spin.
We're getting a very good demonstration of how we have to shift around our stage quite often.
Yeah, right. Do this at least once a day. Okay. Always make sure it stops because those wheels are good. They'll take off. In fact, why not? You even see this? Okay. I'm just going to bring this forward a little bit because I can. Okay. This is a very recent artifact we acquired courtesy of the Galesburg Public Library, which is very nice of them to lend this to us and to let us even know that it existed. And the gorgeous framing done by Frameworks here in town. As you can see, this is a Galesburg Orpheum Theatre movie poster original from the movie, there it is, The Wedding Night, starring Gary Cooper and Anna Sten. Short version is Gary Cooper plays an author who is, down on his luck, and so he moves out to this old Connecticut farm, and he meets a young woman played by Anna Sten, and he has a very romantic time about it. It's an old romance film in that sense, but it was exciting because Anna Sten appeared in person, and it was actually a really it was a really timely addition to our collection of objects because it wasn't too long after we had put this in our lobby and mounted a little display light on it to, kind of give people something to look at as they came by. Jay Redfern from the Register Mail came by and took some very nice pictures of it through the door. I opened the door for him so he could take them from the sidewalk. And it actually was liked on his Instagram by Gary Cooper's daughter, I believe. So thanks, Jay. That was pretty cool. But this is really nice for us to have because more often than not, the artifacts such as posters or handbills or tickets or things like that, we only have in photocopy form because they've been too delicate to preserve or, they didn't belong to us or some other such thing. It was actually interesting when they tore down the Twin West Cinemas very recently. There were a lot of these sorts of posters that they found on the walls of the theaters once they tore down one of the theaters. They found that on the wall, on the old outside wall of the other one, were a bunch of posters plastered against it, and one of them, in fact, was advertising a show at the Gaiety Theater over on Cherry Street. So it was nice to receive some, albeit dusty, confirmation that it certainly did exist and it was there, and it was very well advertised. But this is nice in that it is small enough to be properly framed and taken care of. We certainly wish that we could have framed our scenic flats to make them last a little longer. Best we can do for them is to keep them dry and try not to bump them into something. It's difficult caring for something that's 20 feet tall in that sense when, most rooms are not that tall at all. But it's back to the poster. It's a very nice thing to have, considering we don't really have a whole lot. So once again, yes, thank you to the Galesburg Public Library and Frameworks for giving us such a lovely way to display it too. So that's really nice. Happy to be able to share it with you. If you ever want to come by and look in the window sometime, you might be able to see it yourself. So. All right, well, from here, I think it's time to bring the piano back down. That's one of the more exciting parts because you get to see it land really nicely. As I said before, it's pretty common when you move the, see, look what I do. I don't take the locks off. When you move it without this device, you do kind of have to plop it down on the ground at a certain point, not hard, but there's a point where you reach just above the floor and that doesn't happen with this, luckily. Let me just get, I'll tell you, the wheels themselves move really well, but the bearings are, there we go. Always have to remember I have to compensate for where the rug is because I don't know how this is going to come in. Give us as much room as we can. Why not? Okay. All right. So let's get to it. Take that leg back out. Very important. Don't forget the outrigger. You have to have the outrigger on here. Lock your wheel again. Outrigger's in. So until everything gets situated, you don't really have to tighten this all the way down. You just get the slack out of it just to kind of get it established. Go hit that other wheel lock. There we go. Okay. Now, the important thing to remember is to take the safety strap off because as necessary as it is when it's being moved, if you tried to bring the piano back down with a safety strap on, they would have to have a really big fight about it, and it would be very loud and not very fun to watch. So we make sure the safety strap has been removed. We wiggle all that out of there. And since you can't remove the other end of it until the piano's down, I just leave that trailed off in the other direction. Okay. Now there they are. Before we get too much farther, it's good just to get your casters where you can see them. Once again, keeping them out of the general path, just so we don't trip. I like to give it one more little paranoia check. You know me. Making sure we're all good, and it looks like we're good. Okay, so for this next little bit, I will be inviting Joey up with me. And like I had said earlier, it is certainly possible, in fact, easy to do by yourself. But for this bit, it is a little better to have a second person, simply because when you're trying to get the piano's legs to land in these casters, it's much easier to have one person on either side so that one person is not running around the entire piano, constantly moving casters just a little bit, trying to catch it. So Joey is going to help me out with that, because we just like moving the piano so much, you know. So we're good to go. So down we go. Always standing clear like good school children. All right, one more look. I swear I could look at this thing all day. Okay. Nice and easy. Does this thing have a slow setting or what? Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, this is kind of the dead air portion. Thanks for sticking with us, folks. It is a little less exciting than watching three people struggle or four struggle a piano to the ground. But our backs are grateful, that's for sure. Okay. At this point, we can kind of start getting them where they're going to go. It's more or less going to stay kind of in the same place. It's always necessary to get that base end one in first because it always gives so much trouble when it gets closer to the ground. Gotta kind of get that one in there. Ah, cool. Yeah, that one's the tricky one. Other than that, they all just kind of sit down in their casters by themselves. Okay, yeah, and then as they land, we just keep... Is that one good? Yeah, there it goes. And that last one always looks like it's not going to go, and then you look at it going, all of a sudden it goes. And there we go. That is all there is to it. It's a nice little magnet on that control box. You can just stick it to anything. The first thing we can do now, weight is off the rack. So we can loosen the strap here. Take that off. I'll loosen the outrigger arm here as well. There we go. Cool. All right. Come around to the other end. Take that strap down. First thing to do when you start to pull this out, just a little bit, then you take the couch out. Because if the couch stays in there and you pull it out, it'll just fall out and clatter onto the ground because it only sits there because the piano's on it. And once that's over with, get down here, loosen your wheel locks, and you can pull the machine slowly out. Careful not to bang it on anything. And there we are. And that is how we take the piano up and down.
Alrighty, so at this point, I think you have a couple things that you could show everybody watching. I think you have an artifact that was found up in the fly system, and also a little booklet of something that you'd like to show off.
Oh yes. Going off screen here for a moment. This here is the old hammer. This hammer is very dear to me. In fact, I found this hammer just above our heads up there. It was, who knows why or when or who or how, but it ended up on top of one of the structural I-beams that run east-west over our heads on stage here.
Sitting very safely.
As safely as it could be. You'd be amazed the way things were when I got here in 12. No, the hammer was kind of just, all the weight of it was on the I-beam, but the handle was kind of sticking off the edge. That's how I could see it. So really, all the weight on the hammer end is fine. But it was kind of an odd little place to find something like that. And so I thought, well, you can't stay there. So I brought it down here to live with us on the ground. But given that it is obviously very old and very worn, it even has the letter H pounded into the face of the side of the hammer. It's not the face, the side of the hammer there. I wonder if it belonged to someone named Harold. There's a Harold written in chalk on the side of the I-beams up there. That's another fun little segue. Is the where I found it was near. It was actually atop one of the I-beams that has the names of numerous people written on it. And I've been told by local tradesfolk that when I think it's still the case, when steel workers finish a building and they put the tallest, highest steel element on, they, the various workers will write their names on it. And so we have a number of names written in chalk on the side of one of the beams. In fact, there's an enormous name on the beam that is all the way on the northmost side of the theater, has Olafson written in foot-high letters, like with paint. And that must have been the head steel worker, who knows. But this hammer has been in our display case pretty much ever since I found it. We didn't really know what else to do with it. It's a little worn. It could certainly use a new haft, but it is a lot more useful just kind of as a fun little artifact than an actual hammer. I can't think of anything that I would actually need to drive with a hammer this big in this building. So it's in good hands out there in the display case. You can see it right next to the box office when you come in. Gotta get a kick out of this thing. I love it. Okay, so the other thing that I had laying around, somebody asked earlier, about, you know, little things that, little artifacts that I could show. And this is probably one of my favorites. This is a terribly executed Xerox of the original blueprints of the theater. And this is the basement. I know you can't see this. I do want to get pictures of this scanned and posted in various places, at least some parts. But this shows the way the basement was originally laid out. Also shows the different ways the lobby was shaped before the renovation period, before any of these things happened. It is how I know that all the boxes used to be where they are, that we used to have multiple boxes on the back wall instead of just the mezzanine. It's got the original layout of the balcony bathrooms. It's got all kinds of things that you wouldn't otherwise notice. One of the things that we are able to do when we look back at things like this is kind of like, we were able to kind of conjecture what spaces like this were used for based on their design. And actually that was one of the more interesting things, and it's actually kind of telling, not telling, it's actually kind of appropriate as today is Juneteenth. And you may or may not know that Juneteenth is, it's every June 19th. It's a celebration of the final, I guess the latest reading of the Emancipation Proclamation to enslaved African people in Texas, which was the last state to kind of be read the Emancipation Proclamation in, I believe, 1866. It's a whole year after the Civil War ended. And so that's kind of what Juneteenth is there to remind us of. But one of the things about the Orpheum and its architecture that kind of that ties into that, and I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, is the shape of the theater. The very features of the theater were designed to aid in segregation and Jim Crow laws. And one of those ways is that there is a staircase. It's actually the staircase right next to our concession stand. It's the only continuous staircase that goes all the way to the back of the balcony. Now, why do you figure that would be? It was pretty common, actually, as we were able to find out looking at the various designs of other theaters and talking to other theater operators who run theaters this old, is that that was a pretty common design feature, was for there to be a single staircase that would be built into buildings, and it would lead to the very back of the theater. And in fact, one of the things that these blueprints are able to show me was the original shape of the balcony bathrooms. The bathrooms on the balcony level were the old segregated bathrooms, and that was the only toilets that people of color were allowed to use in this theater. Another thing to mention is as I want to give a shout out to Lou Schultz, who had produced this documentary called Boxcar People. And it's about the Mexican-American population in Galesburg and their history and their culture and their contributions to this community. And one of the stories that I thought was the most prominent, well, maybe not the most prominent, but one of the most prominent aspects of the story was the story of the Orpheum Theater's desegregation incident. And I am probably missing some details, so my apologies if I kind of condense things. But there were three Mexican brothers who were from Galesburg. I wish I could remember their names. And they had been off in the Pacific Theater of World War II, fighting for the American military. And when they came back, they came to a show at the Orpheum. And this is probably then, yes, 1945, 1946, probably 1946. And they came to a movie, and instead of going to the balcony, as would have been where they were supposed to sit, being people of color, they decided to sit right down here on the main floor. And enough patrons complained, or enough ushers had to go tell somebody about it, that the manager came down to speak to the young men and to tell them they had to move. And one of the brothers, I believe it was the oldest, had said, he then plainly said that 4 of them had gone off to fight for this country and only 3 of them came back. And that they felt that if nothing else was going to earn them their right to sit where they wish, that should. And that regardless of what that manager's attitudes personally were, he didn't make them move that day. And so that was a very powerful story of that sort of change being driven by individuals and individual action. And institutionally, segregation may have persisted for another 20 years, and some may say that it still isn't over. But there was that moment where somebody challenged somebody to think of something in terms of their humanity and not just in the institutional laws and regulations they were being asked to uphold as part of their job. And that's something that I think is important to reckon with, especially sitting here with the blueprints for a theater that was specifically built to have segregation enforced into it. I think that, especially given we don't have a whole lot of records of anything else, if that's the one story that we can accurately be able to tell, why not? You know, I mean, there's no sense in hiding it. How strange. But that's kind of a bit of a segue. But I wanted to share that in any case. And as I said, at some point I would like to get this digitized so that people can look at it on our website. It's really quite interesting. It even has little side cutaways. You can see all of the decorative elements that we still have, and even some ones we don't still have. So that's nice. That's a fun little tidbit. So from there, what do we have?
You think we're going to go ahead and conclude show and tell?
We're going to. Lovely, yes.
All righty, perfect. So in that case, thank you very much, Ross, for the show tonight. It was fantastic, and I really enjoyed listening to you, and I hope everyone else at home did too as well. Thank you, everybody, for coming and tuning in, and be sure to hit that subscribe button. So if you have any more questions we didn't get a chance to get to, then maybe in a future TechSpeak Live or something, we could possibly get to them, and you can ask them. All right. So, Ross, if you wouldn't mind letting everybody know what's coming up next here at the Orpheum,
yes.
how they can support during these times, and then go ahead and sign us off.
All right. Well, next up at the Orpheum Theatre, be sure to check out our upcoming musical mixtapes. And in addition to our old TechSpeaks, old musical mixtapes, we've got a lot of content on YouTube, both upcoming and the stuff we've already done. If you're late to the party, go ahead and check out the stuff we've been doing so far. And please remember to, if you like what we're doing here, and if you like the Orpheum Theatre, we'd hope you do, consider donating to support us during this time, because as we cannot have shows, we are unable to generate the usual revenue we do. So please go to our website, www.galesburgorpheum.org, and /support. That's important. And then there will be all manner of different ways you can donate to us and support us there. We truly appreciate that. It is the donors in our community that truly form the backbone of our operational ability. So we thank you for that. Next week, in fact, a week from tonight, a week from this time, in fact, Friday, June 26th at 7:30 p.m., we will have our next live from the Orpheum Theatre. It is going to be featuring Pippi and Daniel. They are a duo of musicians that have, I've heard them play before, but never here, so that's going to be pretty exciting. In fact, one of them, Daniel Leahy, he is one of the principal people involved in bringing this beautiful piano onto our stage. So it'll actually be really nice to reunite him with this piano. I've actually seen him play it once, so it'll be nice to see him play it in front of people. So that is next Friday, June 26th at 7:30 p.m. The tickets are $8 a piece, and you can get that on our website in our ticket section. And you can visit that website to learn more. Once again, it's www.galesburgorpheum.org. Let's see, I think that's about it. So I want to thank you all for joining us here on Tech Speaks. Ross McIntire. I'm Ross McIntire. Thank you again to Joey and Aaron. And Tim's not here, but thank you, Tim. And our board of directors and our volunteers and all of our patrons and all of you there at home. Thank you very much. And have a good evening. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching.